I hope you enjoyed my little introduction, and while watching it, you might have noticed this Fox News article that was displayed on the phone at the end of the scene. The article was published in 2018 when the Hungarian government banned gender studies from universities, claiming it to be an ideology. Then in 2021, the Hungarian government, including anti-LGBTQ Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, passed a law banning any education on homosexuality and gender change from schools. This was one of many of the reactionary movements within Europe against the rise of the gender ideology. In 2020, Romania tried to establish a law to forbid education on gender identity theory, and in September 2021, Poland declared LGBT ideology-free zones, banning equality marches and other LGBT events. These laws are culminations of the anti-gender movement that has been gaining popularity all over the world within the past years. In an article Judith Butler wrote for The Guardian as a reaction to these events, she summarizes, quote, "The attacks on so-called gender ideology have grown in recent years throughout the world, dominating public debate, stoked by electronic networks and backed by extensive right-wing Catholic and evangelical organizations. Although not always in accord, these groups concur that the traditional family is under attack, that children in the classrooms are being indoctrinated to become homosexuals, and that gender is a dangerous, if not diabolical, ideology threatening to destroy families, local cultures, civilization, and even man himself." Butler notes how any movement that questions the binary gender categories that are identified as the natural consequence of the biological sex is seen as a threat to the standards of the heteronormative family. Something that I found particularly interesting when I decided to make a video about this subject was the use of the word ideology that the anti-gender movement utilizes. Following Butler's trail of thought, it seems as if such terms are more used for their rhetorical impact and less as a clearly defined critical term within a well-constructed argument. Nevertheless, I found the use of the word quite ironic, because couldn't one argue that one essential point behind a deconstructionist scientific program such as gender studies is in fact particularly to expose traditional gender norms as being themselves inherently ideological? Therefore, in this video, I want to try to philosophically explore what ideology and gender means, to find out if there is a meaningful point from which we can criticize certain things as being ideological. So sit back, put on your sunglasses, and get ready for pure ideology.
The problem of ideology is the wrong way to address a problem.
So what does ideology actually mean? The French word Ideologie derives from the ancient Greek words idea and logos, which means the study of ideas. The term ideology was coined within the French Enlightenment by a guy whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce here, and whom I'm just going to be referring to as Tracy. So, being an aristocrat, this Tracy guy used the word to try and justify his liberal ideology in the times of the French Revolution. Later on, the term was picked up and used in several different ways within the social sciences. For the purpose of this video, it is important to differentiate two main applications of the word. One of them is the descriptive notion of ideology that can be found in political philosophy, anthropology, and the sociology of knowledge. Here, ideology merely describes the attitudes, beliefs, worldviews, and customs of different cultures, groups, and societies. Within this definition, all collectives basically have their own ideology, and the term is not used as a normative notion for critique. That brings us to our second definition, which is the critical notion of ideology. This whole theoretical field is often referred to as the critique of ideology. This tradition finds its roots in the writings of Karl Marx. Within Marx's materialist theory, ideology is the product of a process in which the capitalist production appears to the people who are part of it as something natural. For Marx, the way that people think about the world and society is determined by their place within the capitalist production. Accordingly, the ideas and conceptions that people have about the world aren't a reflection of how things actually are, but just how they appear to them as something natural while they are actually a part of societal reproduction. Within this process, humans project certain characteristics into commodities as if they naturally had them. If we go into a store, for example, to buy ourselves a new table, we'll value it based on what we think it is worth. If we then realize, oh, this table is way too expensive or really cheap, we implicitly naturalize the relation that commodities have within the capitalist production. Apart from the use value the table might have for our lives, there is no hidden ontological value to be found somewhere inside the table. The value we assume here is a naturalized abstraction from the exchange value the table has within capitalist production. This is what Marx called the commodity fetish. The use of the word fetish shouldn't be confused with its common meaning, but is rather related to its original meaning, where it expresses something to be bewitched or mystified. The way that commodities appear within the capitalist society is holding other value, apart from the use value it has for humans, for Marx was such a mystification. Furthermore, for him, ideology can be seen as something that is objectively necessary in relation to the societal circumstances humans find themselves in. Ideology, then, for Marx is a reflection and a result of their material societal location, where they form certain beliefs in accordance to the way that economic forces organize and situate them within society. Therefore, the ideological ideas that humans have are a necessary result of the material structure of society. While necessary, it is also false for Marx, though, in the sense that a particular societal relation is being seen as if it was natural and without alternatives. In the early 20th century, the Frankfurt School picked up on Marx's conception to develop a so-called critical theory, which pretty much is all about criticizing ideology. In 1924, the first generation of critical theorists, most famously Max Horkheimer and Theodor v. Adorno, founded the Frankfurt School of Social Sciences to approach their task. According to Adorno and Horkheimer, the task of a critical theory was to oppose the model of what they called traditional theory. With the term traditional theory, the authors refer to pretty much all common sciences, which in their understanding were ideological because they are somewhat detached from their historical genesis and societal purposes. Similarly to Marx, the idea that Horkheimer and Adorno developed here is that a particular historically constructed societal role, in this case that of science, is being mystified. Critical theorists claim that the way traditional theory appears as something objective and value-neutral is in fact instrumentally grounded in societal reproduction. In comparison to that, critical theory itself reflects the impossibility of such value neutrality and self-reflects its own very purpose as that of emancipation from societal and capitalist oppression. Therefore, critical theory must deconstruct these false conceptions and ideas and enlighten humans about these false beliefs they form in relation to the reproduction of their societal practices. Accordingly, the critique of ideology cannot be understood independently from its purpose, which is to emancipate humans from the societal oppressions that they are themselves continuously reproducing in their everyday lives. Let's return for a moment to the definition of ideology. We have seen how Marx and the critical theorists criticize different things as ideological. Our interpretations of commodities as something natural is not the same as the claim of value neutrality within science. So one could ask, what is actually the uniting property that all ideologies have in common? This becomes more clear if we expand our definition of ideology and understand it as any type of interpretation, justification, and conception that we can have that can both be explicit in the sense of a theoretical conception such as the idea of value neutrality, but also more implicit, such as a certain custom of how certain things have to be correctly done. With this in mind, both the commodity fetish and the value-neutral stance of traditional theory can be interpreted as ideological. And they are both false insofar as these interpretations are inadequate for understanding the social objects they are related to. Philosopher Sally Haslanger writes, quote, "Ideology critique disrupts conceptual dogmatism. One goal of ideology critique is to elucidate the conceptual and narrative frameworks that undergird our social interaction, thus making them available for critical examination." We could therefore also say that ideology critique is the social deconstruction of social categories that we take for granted and that we treat as if they were inevitable. Often this happens in relation to problems or conflicts that already exist, but in which the beliefs and interpretations within them can't adequately make sense of them. It is furthermore important to point out that certain social conceptions and interpretations only make sense within a certain context of meanings. Hence, one can only understand why certain things are important or valued by a certain group of people if we understand the background of social meanings that are attached to it. Therefore, particular conceptions wouldn't make sense if we excluded them from a certain context of meaning. Furthermore, this background has a certain history through which we can trace back why certain things have become meaningful. Let me give you an example. In our society, it is a common belief that working hard is something somehow valuable. People might have different interpretations, though, as to why working hard is valuable. They, for example, might think that humans are naturally hunter-gatherers and that within this context, men always had the role of working hard to be able to sustain the community by hunting. But they could also have different contextual assumptions, such that God only redeems those that work hard. Therefore, if we want to criticize certain ideological interpretations, it is important to see that these interpretations are related to a background of other meanings. Money, for example, in the form we know it, only makes sense in relation to the background of a capitalist economy and a certain capitalist way of living. The fact that we interact with money within our daily social practices presupposes that we hold certain kinds of meanings attached to it that normatively guide us. Furthermore, there is a certain history attached to these ideas. The ethics of the hard-working laborer, for example, only really started being a thing within around the last 200 years with the emergence of wage labor. Ideology critique, therefore, is a tool to deconstruct interpretations such as these by showing that they are in fact not inevitable. For understanding the task of ideology critique better, it is helpful to envision it as a collective societal psychoanalysis in which the therapist is the critical theorist and the patient is society. While the patient sits on the couch and talks about their problems, the therapist will try to uncover the real meanings behind the patient's interpretations, and he won't take the words of the patient for granted, but see them as distortions, biases, and compensations. The therapist will furthermore try and make the patient aware of the way that they mystify the actual motivations and meanings of their interpretations. Similarly, the critical theorist doesn't take the institutional and individual meanings, conceptions, and interpretations within societies for granted, but looks further behind them to uncover the actual meanings and purposes behind them. And similarly to the patient who, through this disclosure, can free themselves from the inner coercions and compulses, the people within a society can, ideally at least, emancipate themselves from their ideologically self-directed heteronomy to a possible state of self-determination. Well, it's probably not that easy. You'll also need revolution and all that good stuff, but you get the idea. For any meaningful and constructive change to happen, we first need to understand the problem, which means that we need to deconstruct our false interpretations, our ideologies. So you might be able to see where I'm going here. I want to claim that gender roles themselves are in fact ideological. But before I'm going to argue that claim, we need to understand the underlying question of what gender exactly is. A very common definition of gender within feminist theory is that gender is the social meaning of sex. Consistent with this definition, philosopher Sally Haslanger describes how through the identification of certain bodily features, one gets marked as man or woman. Through this, the social agents then occupy particular social roles, which bear social significance within the dominant societal power relations. After being marked as a woman, for example, one gets treated in particular ways that are associated with the social roles women carry within society. Furthermore, there is a certain set of behaviors that are expected from women. Sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild refers to this as feeling rules. Feeling rules determine the spectrum of how men and women are expected to handle their emotions. Women, for example, are seen as sensitive and gentle, which qualifies them to perform certain emotional roles within the societal power relations. But how does someone exactly acquire gender roles? According to Icelandic philosopher Àsta, gender roles get conferred onto the social agents. They write, "A base feature of a person is socially significant in a context such that people taken to have that feature get conferred onto them a social status in the context. The social status is the socially constructed feature." Let me give you an example. If I go to a dinner party and dress in a certain masculine way, this way of stereotypical dressing is seen with a certain significance. Àsta calls this the base property. This significance does not need to be perceived consciously. In fact, most of the times it is subconscious. Through dressing this way, I will then probably get conferred a social status onto myself by the people who ever have the interpretative power within the particular social context that is the dinner party I am attending. Each participant within this process, however, brings their own assumptions and meanings as to what gender roles are possible and apt within a particular context. This is what Àsta calls social maps. Again, the social agents that confer the gender status don't need to be aware that they are doing it. Social maps are often invisible and subconscious. Furthermore, for Àsta, it is highly context-dependent how the conferral of the status looks like. A person, for example, that gets conferred onto them the status of a woman will have a different status within their role as a mother at home, or within their work environment as being a flight attendant, or within the book club with their friends. Depending on the context, these conferrals may come with different enablements and constraints. It is important to keep in mind, though, that within different social contexts and the social maps of the participants within them, the gender roles are constantly reproduced while both ourselves and others situate us within social maps. Gender roles, therefore, constantly have to be renewed. Judith Butler accordingly speaks of performativity as the ongoing social reproduction of gender. Butler says that we constantly perform the gender roles within acts of social communication in which we constantly play these roles and with that reassure ourselves and others about them and normalize them. But why do we keep reproducing gender roles and not just stop doing it? Well, on one hand, social maps are what constitutes our identities and with that our realities. We can't just drop them. Furthermore, the social realities in which social statuses get conferred on us have a powerful influence on us. On the other hand, gender roles also have a systematic purpose within society. The role of a woman, for example, is useful for certain aspects within the social reproduction of capitalism, such as mothering. Sally Haslanger writes, quote, "The interpretation of human bodies as fit for some activities and not others, motivates and justifies divisions of labor and the separation of domains and forms of activity, that is, social roles. For these roles, then, there are norms, what it takes to do that labor or activity well. For example, those interpreted as having a female body are regarded as fit or suited for mothering, which is taken to entail a different relation to small children than fathering. Correspondingly, there are different norms for mothering and fathering. Even if the norms for mothering and fathering differ across time and culture, what makes a good mother is not thought to be the same as what makes a good father. But if females are expected to perform the role of mothering and to perform it well, then rather than coerce them to fulfill this role, it is much better for females to be motivated to perform it. So the norms must be internalized, that is, they must be understood as part of one's identity and defining what would count as one's success as an individual." From here it becomes clear in what sense gender roles can be seen as ideology. Similarly to how we defined ideology in the first part, gender roles are socially constructed but appear as something inevitable and natural. So with this in mind, let's return to the questions raised in the beginning of this video, where I was talking about the anti-gender movement and the way this group tries to instrumentalize the idea of gender as ideological. Again, remember that we said that ideology critique is the deconstruction of social interpretations and categories that we treat for granted as if they were inevitable. If we apply this to the claim of the anti-gender movement that the idea of gender is ideological, it immediately becomes clear that this is not sensible. The notion of gender is used for the deconstruction of gender roles. Therefore, it is an act of ideology critique by definition, as it is a theoretical approach to deconstruct the gender roles that we treat as if they were natural. On the contrary, the anti-gender movement itself appears to be an intrinsically ideological project, as it tries to further mystify and naturalize these socially constructed conceptions of gender roles.